Hi, I'm Jerry Jones. For this class, the study of the books of Luke and Acts, I chose as my pericope Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. There are four scenes in the first 19 verses of Luke chapter 6. The first two are conflict narratives featuring, in scene 1, the disciples plucking corn on the Sabbath, and in scene 2, the healing of the withered hand, also on the Sabbath. And the third is the calling of the 12 apostles upon a mountain after Jesus had spent the night there in prayer. The fourth scene is an awesome display of Jesus' power in healing and deliverance when all of those in a great multitude were healed or delivered from demonic power. By way of context, Luke 6, 1 through 19 is the second half of a major section of Luke that begins at chapter 5, verse 1. While there is some consensus concerning this, scholars do not agree on all the details of what constitutes this section. I see the section beginning at chapter 5, verse 1, with the call to the disciples to become fishers of men and the significant miracles that attended that call. I see it ending with the calling of the 12 apostles and the miracles that attended that call. In between are four conflict narratives, the last two of which begin our pericope, the plucking of corn on the Sabbath and the healing of a withered hand in the synagogue, also on the Sabbath. Let's look at the pericope from a rhetorical criticism viewpoint, utilizing a series of questions designed by James L. Resseguet and published in Narrative Criticism of the New Testament. This was assigned to us by Professor Brickell as an aid in examining a narrative as an organic whole, as Resseguet says. Let's first think about rhetoric. There is a repetition of themes, situations, and actions all occurring in the first two scenes of the passage. The theme is, of course, the nature of the Sabbath and Jesus' relationship to it. In each, the situation is framed by actions taken by either Jesus or his disciples on the Sabbath day. Also, the action of the Pharisees in criticizing Jesus and his replies to that criticism connect these two scenes. In fact, all four scenes of Luke 6, 1 through 19 are connected by a repetition and interconnection of the introductory words. 6:1 begins, one Sabbath. 6:6, on another Sabbath. 6:12, scene 3, now during those days. And finally, scene 4, he came down with them, 6:17. This creates a theme of Jesus in purposeful action, defending his disciples, healing a withered hand, choosing the 12 apostles, and healing and delivering a great multitude of people. There are two rhetorical questions within our pericope. In scene 1, Jesus uses a rhetorical question to set up his defense of the disciples. Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and gave some to his companions. 6:3b through 4. The second rhetorical question also dealt with the Sabbath. It's found in scene 2. I ask you, Jesus says, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? 6:9. Each of these questions places Jesus' detractors in an awkward situation. In scene 1, they cannot admit that they are unaware of David's violation of the Sabbath because they're supposed to be experts in the scriptures. But to acknowledge they are aware is to tacitly grant Jesus' point. In scene 2, to answer the question without accepting Jesus' premise is to take the side of doing harm and destroying life, an obviously untenable position. There is also a parallelism found in the scene 2 rhetorical question. I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? This do good, do harm, save life, destroy life is an antithesis type of parallelism and dramatically confronts the scribes and Pharisees. It changes the argument from simply applying rote traditional interpretation of the law into one of a broader moral context in which to understand the purpose of the Sabbath is paramount. The scenes are demarcated geographically. There's a grain field, a synagogue, a mountain, and a plain. And in each scene, the narrative begins with Jesus in action. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, 6:1. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue, 6:6. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, 6:12. And finally, he came down with them and stood on a level place, 6:17. The imagery is that of a vibrantly engaged Jesus, moving purposefully through these significant vignettes towards some yet undisclosed goal. There's also powerful irony in the second scene of the pericope. The scribes and the Pharisees watch Jesus, evidently knowing there is a man with a withered hand in the congregation. They're watching to see if Jesus will heal on the Sabbath and thus give them an opportunity to attack him. Jesus, Luke tells us, knows what they're thinking. There is an undercurrent of sly humor and irony in Jesus' handling of the situation. He called the man with the withered hand to stand in the center of the congregation, then asks the scribes and Pharisees a rhetorical question. I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? 6:9. Pausing, waiting apparently for an answer, Jesus looks around the room. Luke says, at all of them, 6:10. Of course, there's no possible answer, and when none is offered, Jesus simply asks the man to stretch out your hand, 6:10. He doesn't add, and be healed. He does not touch the hand or in any way even claim to heal the man. But when the man holds out his hand, it's restored. Seemingly, Jesus did nothing. Of course, his enemies knew they had been challenged and defeated by Jesus and were filled with fury and began to plot against him. Resseguet's second question deals with characterization. There are only two characters who speak at all in this pericope. Jesus speaks in the first two scenes, and some of the Pharisees speak in the first. The first and only words of the Pharisees are these: why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? Luke uses these words to establish the conflict in the narratives. In the second scene, Jesus himself institutes the conflict by his first two words, addressed to the man with the withered hand. Come and stand here. He simultaneously makes the man an object lesson and reveals to the scribes and Pharisees that he is aware of their thoughts and their intentions. The action of Jesus teaching in the synagogue in scene 2 serves not only to reveal his role as teacher, but his commitment to the culture and the tradition of Judaism. He is asserting by teaching in the synagogue the words he had spoken as recorded in Matthew's gospel. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm come not to destroy, but to fulfill. Matthew 5:17. Most of the characters in Luke 6:1-19 are flat. The disciples, the man with the withered hand, the apostles, the crowd. Jesus himself is rounded but not dynamic in that he does not grow or change. The fury of the scribes and Pharisees moves the plot forward toward the crucifixion. That is the final solution for what they discuss here in 6:11, what they might do to Jesus. The entire series of conflict narratives serves to reveal the motives behind the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. Thirdly, let's look at point of view. The ideological point of view of the narrative is Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath and Lord of disease and unclean spirits. The point of view of the Pharisees and scribes is expressed in scene 1 when they ask, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. For them, protecting traditional applications of Sabbath restrictions is overwhelmingly important. But Jesus' point of view is revealed in his words. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, 6:5. Of course, the overall point of view harmonizes with Jesus' point of view and conflicts with his opponent's point of view. Luke's narrative viewpoint makes strange the viewpoint of the scribes and Pharisees and sets the stage for the ongoing challenge that Christianity will prove to be to Judaism throughout the remainder of the New Testament. Now, let's study the pericope from the standpoint of its use of the Old Testament. In my second paper, I did this by utilizing the 9 steps discussed in Handbook on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, Exegesis and Interpretation by G.K. Beale, as we had been instructed to by Professor Brickell. In Luke 6:1 through 19, there are no quotations of the Old Testament. There are 7 allusions and a possible echo. Let's look at each of them. In scene 1, as Peale and Schneibel point out in commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, quote, a number of elements in this text presupposes a knowledge of relevant Old Testament and Jewish traditions, plucking of grains in the fields, Sabbath regulations, and the story of David in the house of God, close quote. Plucking grain. There are 3 Old Testament references that relate to the actions of the disciples as they pass through the fields. 2 of them, Leviticus 19:9 and 10 and 23:22, speak of the poor and the alien being allowed to gather the grain from the corners of the fields. Deuteronomy 23:25 allows for anyone to enter a neighbor's vineyard and eat all the grapes they want, but forbids them carrying grapes away in a container. The exact nature of the Pharisees' charge is unclear. This is why these passages are so important. Are they saying the actions of the disciples themselves are unlawful? Or are those actions only unlawful because they're being done on the Sabbath? Since the activities of the disciples seem to be sanctioned by the law in these passages that Luke alludes to, most scholars agree with the latter. Jesus' response to the criticism of the Pharisees in scene 1 contains an allusion to the events recorded in 1 Samuel 21:1 through 9. David is fleeing from Saul and comes to Nob, the city of priests, and there he finds the priest Ahimelech. David needs help. The most pressing need is that of food. He lies to Ahimelech, claiming he's on a secret mission for King Saul, that there's a rendezvous coming with the young men, and he needs bread. He asks for 5 loaves and is told there's nothing available except holy bread, the bread of the presence, even though the bread is to be eaten only by priests. Ahimelech agrees to give David 12 loaves, all that he has. This story of David's receiving bread that was lawful only to be eaten by the priest presupposes an understanding of the ritual use of the shewbread as described in Exodus 40:23 and Leviticus 24:5 through 9. These 2 allusions explain why that bread was legal only for priests. Philo describes the bread of the presence, and Josephus describes the careful arrangement of the loaves upon the table along with the accompanying spices that were used. The critics that hear Jesus use this are speechless, as Jesus closes the scene by announcing that's not the source of his authority. His authority comes from himself and no one else. James R. Edwards points out that verse 5, the Greek syntax is bold. Kyrios, or Lord, is shifted prominently to the front of the sentence, and Son of Man is placed at the end, thereby accentuating, he says, both titles. It could well be rendered, just who is Lord of the Sabbath? The Son of Man is. Scene 3, the healing of the withered hand. Powell and Schnabel see one allusion in the second scene of my pericope, but it is difficult to identify any certain Old Testament reference for this conflict narrative. I've chosen Exodus 31:13 and 14 to illustrate why so much effort went into developing such detailed rules for Sabbath observance. You shall keep my Sabbaths, For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from among the people. The issue surfaces in scene 2 in the question of Jesus, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? And the good in this case that he's speaking of is to heal a withered hand, not a life-threatening situation. And because it didn't threaten life, the Sabbath restrictions would not permit it. The Pharisaic Sabbath laws was clear enough. Only in case of mortal illness was medical help permitted. Rabbinic tradition, in fact, forbade even straightening a deformed body or setting a broken limb on the Sabbath. The Babylonian Talmud offers these instructions, quote, they anoint and massage the stomach, but they do not have it kneaded or scraped. They do not go down to a muddy wrestling ground, and they do not induce vomiting. And they do not straighten the limb of a child or set a broken limb. He whose hand or foot was dislocated should not pour cold water over them, but he washes in the usual way. And if he is healed, he is healed. Jesus showed by healing that man's withered hand that these restrictions were in violation of higher laws, the higher laws of grace and mercy. Finally, in the final scene of the calling of the 12, Powell and Schnabel point out that some commentators have detected an Exodus allusion in the calling of the 12, seeing a connection with Exodus 24:4, where Moses sets up 12 pillars, a connection with the 12 tribes. However, they don't see that as conclusive. Finally, the two conflict narratives and the designation of the apostles and the attendant miracles, which make up Luke 6:1-19, are significant components of the larger Lucan purpose. Both conflicts deal with the Sabbath, the fundamental of Judaism, while the appointing of the apostles serves to introduce these pivotal characters and the role for which they will play from this moment onward. The remarkable display of power in the final scene adds an exclamation point to the significant events that precede it, reminding the apostles and the disciples that they are following the Son of Man, who is not Lord of the Sabbath only, but Lord of all things. In studying this pericope, we see that here, as in much of his writing, Luke displays skill and a certain elegance in his use of the Old Testament. In the two conflict narratives, we see one of the foundational observances of Judaism used as a tool to reveal the identity, the power, and purpose of Jesus Christ. This revelation is handled with an economy of words, but also with a richness in both imagery and rhetorical technique. It fascinates the reader. Examined through the techniques of Resseguet and Beale, these narratives once again take on the freshness and wonder they must have had when Theophilus read them for the very first time.